The stars above Sector 9 didn't twinkle. They never did out here. This far from any sun, light didn't dance. It just sat there, cold and distant, like old photographs of people who had already died. Commander Sarah Ellison had stared at those stars every night for 14 months, and she still hadn't gotten used to the silence between them. The Ardent was not a beautiful ship. She had been built in a hurry, in the final years of Earth's outer expansion program, when budgets were shrinking and fear was growing. She was wide across the middle, with a reinforced hull that made her look swollen, like something that had been inflated too fast. Her engine compartments sat low on her belly, 3 enormous drive chambers that groaned when pushed past 60% power. The crew called her the pig. Not with cruelty, with a particular kind of affection that soldiers give to things they depend on. She carried a crew of 219 people. 219 people who had not spoken to Earth in 31 days. Sarah stood at the forward observation deck, both hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee she had forgotten to drink. Behind her, the soft hum of the bridge computers filled the silence. Status updates, atmospheric readings, the slow, patient breathing of a ship in standby mode. Navigator Dex Okafor was at his station, running fuel calculations for the 4th time that morning, not because he needed to but because it gave him something to do with his hands. Weapons Officer Lena Birch sat with her arms crossed, watching a secondary screen that showed nothing but static on all 18 contact frequencies. 31 days of static. Still nothing from the relay stations? Sarah asked without turning around. Nothing, Lena said. Her voice was flat. Not emotionless, just worn thin. I've tried every compression band we have. If there's a signal out there, it's buried under something I can't identify. Interference? Maybe. Or the relay stations are just. She didn't finish. Sarah turned around. Say it. Lena looked at her directly. Or the relay stations are gone, Commander. The bridge went very quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of routine, but the specific silence that happens when a group of people hear something they were already afraid of, spoken out loud for the first time. Dex cleared his throat. We still have the last confirmed coordinates from Fleet Command. The rendezvous point at Corridor 12. If we push the drives to 70%. We discussed 70%, Sarah said. I know we discussed it. The starboard drive chamber has a stress fracture in the secondary coupling ring. 70% risks a cascade shutdown. I know that too. Dex turned in his seat to look at her. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of steady eyes that made people want to follow him. But if the relay stations are really gone, then Fleet Command doesn't know where we are. And if Fleet Command doesn't know where we are, then being careful about a coupling ring is the least of our problems. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the stars. 55%, she said. We hold at 55%, and we do not exceed it unless I give the order. We reach Corridor 12 on schedule, and we do this right. Dex nodded slowly. Understood. She picked up her coffee, remembered it was cold, and drank it anyway. There was something almost meditative about choosing discomfort when everything else was outside your control. She had learned that from her father. He had been a mechanic in the Outer Expansion's first wave, a quiet man who worked on mining haulers at the edge of the solar system, who came home smelling like machine oil, and who fell asleep reading paperback books that he never finished. He used to say that fear was just the body's way of paying attention. Pay attention, he would say, but don't let it drive. Sarah had been paying attention for 31 days. She was very tired of paying attention. She was about to tell Dex to log the new heading when the ship's proximity sensor fired. Not the slow, rolling alert of a detected object at long range, but the hard, sharp triple tone of something that had appeared at close range, suddenly, without the gradual signature of conventional approach. Every head on the bridge snapped up. Contact, said Ensign Yusuf Park from the sensor station, and his voice had gone very young. Close contact. 700 kilometers off the port bow. It appeared. There was no approach vector. It just appeared. Sarah was already moving toward the center of the bridge. Classification. Yusuf's hands were moving fast over his panel. It's not in any catalog I have. Mass reading is, he stopped. He stared at his screen. He looked up at Sarah with an expression she had never seen on him before. "Commander, the mass reading on this object is 2.3 times the Ardent." Silence. "Active scan," Sarah said quietly. "They'll know we're looking. They already know we're here." Active scan. Yusuf ran the scan. The results came back in 4 seconds, a 3D rendering that built itself on the main screen piece by piece, like something assembling itself out of darkness. The ship that appeared on that screen looked nothing like anything in Earth's design history. It was long and tapered at both ends, like a bone, but irregular, its surface covered in geometric protrusions that followed no pattern Sarah could identify. Its hull material was reading as non-metallic, something the scanner described with the unhelpful notation, "Composition undefined." It had no visible weapon ports, no visible engine exhausts, no visible anything that Sarah recognized as functional, which didn't mean it wasn't dangerous. It just meant they didn't understand it yet. "Any transmission?" she asked. "Nothing on any band," Lena said, and then immediately corrected herself. "Wait." Her fingers moved. "There's something. It's not on any frequency we use. It's almost below the threshold of detection. Like they're broadcasting very quietly. Can you amplify it?" "Already running it through the translation matrix." A pause. "Commander, the translation matrix is confused. It's finding structural patterns that suggest intentional language, but it can't match any phoneme base. Whoever is transmitting this, they've never spoken to us before." Sarah stood in the center of the bridge and looked at the bone-shaped ship on the screen. 2.3 times the Ardent. Appeared from nothing. Composition undefined. She thought of her father. "Pay attention, but don't let it drive. All crew to alert stations," she said calmly. "Weapons do not arm. Shields to passive configuration. I want every antenna we have pointed at that ship, and I want this translation matrix working around the clock." She sat down in the command chair. "And somebody make a fresh pot of coffee," she added. "We're going to be here for a while." The translation matrix worked for 9 hours. Sarah did not sleep. She sat in the command chair and drank 3 cups of coffee and read the crew rotation reports and pretended to be calm, which was one of the most exhausting things she had ever done professionally. Around hour 4, ship's Dr. Marcus Vey brought her a food tray she didn't ask for and sat down uninvited in the auxiliary chair beside her. "You should eat," he said. "I'm eating," she said, gesturing at the coffee. "That's not food. It has calories." Marcus Vey was 61 years old and had served on 4 deep space vessels and had the patient stubbornness of someone who had outlasted many commanders who thought they didn't need to eat. He didn't say anything else. He just sat there until she picked up the fork. She ate. "How's the crew?" she asked between bites. "Scared," he said simply, "but functional. The fear is the kind that sharpens people, not the kind that breaks them. At least for now. And if this goes on longer than for now, then I'll have different answers." He paused. "The young ones are handling it better than the mid-career officers, interestingly. Ensign Park looks half terrified, but he hasn't left his station in 9 hours. Lieutenant Commander Reyes hasn't stopped running probability models. Fear is making them work harder." "And the experienced ones?" Marcus looked at her with the precise expression of a doctor who has decided to be honest. "The experienced ones have seen enough to know that unknown is almost always more dangerous than hostile. Hostile you can plan for. Unknown keeps changing shape." Sarah put her fork down. "Is that directed at me?" "You have read the translation matrix results 6 times in the last hour," he said. "Each time you read it, you tap your left thumb against your knee exactly 4 times. I've counted." She looked down at her left hand. She hadn't noticed. "Go eat something warm and sleep for 2 hours," Marcus said gently. "I'll have them wake you the instant anything changes." She almost argued. Then she thought of her father, who used to say that the body is not a machine and does not apologize for this. She stood up, handed the command to Dex with quiet instructions, and went to her quarters. She slept for exactly 90 minutes before Lena's voice came through the speaker. "Commander, the transmission has changed." She was back on the bridge in 4 minutes, still pulling her jacket straight. The translation matrix had not decoded the language. That would have been too much to hope for. But it had done something more interesting. It had found the architecture. The transmission from the bone-shaped ship was not a spoken language in any sense the matrix recognized. It communicated in what the matrix called pressure gradients, patterns of compressed and expanded signal density that followed a logic closer to mathematics than to speech. Not numbers exactly, but relationships, ratios, the language of how one thing related to another. "It's beautiful," said the linguistics officer, a small, quiet woman named Dr. Peta Fano, who had been awake for most of the 9 hours and who looked like she was running on something stronger than caffeine. "Look at this structure here." She pulled up a visual representation on the secondary screen, a cascading pattern of peaks and valleys. This recurring motif appears at the beginning and end of every transmission cycle. It's not a greeting. It's not an identification code. It's closer to a frame, a way of saying what follows exists inside this context. "What context?" Sarah asked. "That's what I haven't cracked yet." Peta pulled her glasses off and rubbed her eyes. But the context itself is consistent. Whatever they're saying it with a very clear sense of what kind of statement it is. And what kind is it? Peta hesitated. She put her glasses back on. She looked at the screen, and then at Sarah. "Directive." The mathematical signature of every message they send has the structural shape of a directive statement. Not a question, not a description, a directive. She paused again. "They're telling us to do something, Commander. We just don't know what." Sarah stared at the cascading peaks and valleys on the screen. "Can we respond?" "In their language, not yet." But Peta moved to a different panel and pulled up something she had been building for the last 3 hours, a return signal, composed of the same compression gradient structure, but arranged in a pattern that repeated the frame motif, followed by a simple mathematical sequence. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8. If their language is structurally mathematical, this is the universal signal for "we hear you" and "we are thinking." A Fibonacci sequence inside their own signal architecture. It says, "We recognize pattern. We are pattern makers too." The bridge was very still. "Send it," Sarah said.
Peta sent it.
For 47 seconds, nothing happened. Then the bone-shaped ship responded, and this time, the transmission was 3 times longer than any previous message, and the matrix lit up with structural patterns that Peta had never seen before. She worked through them in silence, her pen moving fast on the paper notepad she still carried even in the age of neural interfaces, because she thought better with her hands. After 11 minutes, she looked up. "They changed the directive," she said. "The frame is the same, but the content has shifted. There's a new element in the signal architecture. She stopped. "I think it's a time marker. They've added something that functions as a duration." "A duration for what?" Peta's face was careful. "A duration for the directive. They're saying do the thing. Within this amount of time." She looked at her calculations. "I can't give you an exact conversion, but the proportional mathematics suggests the duration is short. Very short." Lena Birch looked up from the weapons panel. "They're giving us a deadline." "Yes," Peta said quietly. "I believe they are." Sarah stood very still. "For doing what?" she asked. Peta looked at her. "I don't know yet." The bridge hummed. The stars outside didn't move. The bone-shaped ship sat 700 kilometers off the port bow, enormous and silent in the way that pressure is silent. Not the absence of force, but the presence of it, waiting. Sarah sat back down in the command chair. She tapped her thumb against her knee 4 times. She caught herself doing it. "Pay attention. But don't let it drive."
"Keep working," she said.
"All of you. We have a deadline, and we don't know what it means, which means every second counts." She looked at the bone-shaped ship on the screen. "What are you asking us to do?" The ship didn't answer. Not yet. The answer came at 0340 hours. Peta Fano had not slept. Her notepad was covered in 6 layers of scrawled calculations, the earlier ones nearly invisible under the later ones, and she had drunk so much black tea that her hands had developed a faint but constant tremor that she was ignoring professionally. She had the translation matrix running on 7 parallel tracks, cross-referencing the compression gradient language against every mathematical framework in its database, not to find meaning directly, but to find the shape of meaning. The way you can tell a sentence is a question by its rising structure even in a language you've never heard. At 0338, she found the shape. At 0340, she understood it. She stood up from her station very slowly, in the careful, deliberate way of someone trying not to show that their legs have gone unsteady. She walked to the command chair where Sarah was sitting with her eyes open and her expression neutral, doing the thing she had been doing for hours, which was appearing calm as a form of leadership. "Commander," Peta said. Her voice was completely controlled. "I need to tell you what the directive says." Sarah looked at her. Something in Peta's stillness told her immediately that this was not technical information. This was something else. "Go ahead." "The directive has 2 components," Peta said. "The first component is the action they're requiring. The second component is the time frame." She paused. "The action, based on the directional pressure gradients and the spatial reference markers they've been building into the signal for the last several hours. The action is yielding. Positional yielding. They want us to move the ship." "Move it where?" "Away. The directionality is clear. Away from our current position. Away from this sector. They want us to leave."
Peta paused again.
"Or, more precisely, they want us to stop being here." The bridge was quiet. Dex had his eyes on Sarah. Lena had one hand resting near the weapons panel, not touching it, just near it. "And the time frame?" Sarah asked. Peta looked at her notepad. "The duration marker in their signal. I've cross-referenced it against the baseline transmission frequency they've been using, which appears to be a fixed standard for them, a kind of absolute clock reference." She looked up. 20 seconds. Nobody moved. 20 seconds, Sarah said. "Yes. They want us to leave. In 20 seconds. That's what the mathematics says." Sarah looked at the bone-shaped ship on the main screen. It hadn't moved. It was just there, enormous, patient, its undefined hull catching no light from the distant stars. Around it, she now noticed for the first time, the space had a slight visual distortion, like heat shimmer but wrong, like the geometry of the area close to the ship was slightly different from the geometry everywhere else. "That distortion around the hull," she said to Yusuf. "How long has it been there?" Yusuf checked his readings. "Sensors first logged it 6 hours ago. I thought it was a calibration artifact." "Is it still showing the same intensity?" Yusuf's hands moved. He checked.
His face changed. "No."
It's grown. The radius of the distortion has increased by 31% in the last 6 hours. And it's still growing." "What does that mean?" "I don't know," Yusuf said honestly. "We have no framework for it. Whatever system is producing that distortion, we've never observed it before. It's not a known weapon signature. It's not a known propulsion effect. It's what they use," Sarah said quietly. "Whatever they use, that distortion is how they do things. And it's been growing for 6 hours."
She was thinking very fast.
20 seconds. In 20 seconds, what could the Ardent do? She could fire engines and move, but at 55% safe thrust, meaningful positional change took 6 minutes minimum, not 20 seconds. She could push the drives to maximum emergency thrust, ignore the stress fracture in the coupling ring, and risk a cascade shutdown. She could do nothing and find out what happened when their deadline passed. She could respond with Peta's signal architecture, try to communicate, try to negotiate, but Peta had just spent 9 hours building the translation of a single directive message, and they had 20 seconds. 20 seconds. She thought of what Marcus had said. Hostile you can plan for. Unknown keeps changing shape. But she was also thinking about something else. She was thinking about the distortion. "Peta," she said. "The frame structure they use in all their messages, the contextual frame. You said it wasn't a greeting or an identification. You said it was a way of saying what follows exists inside this context." "Yes."
"What context?"
"You said you hadn't cracked it. Have you made any progress?" Peta blinked. She hadn't expected this question right now. She looked at her notepad. "I have a partial reading. The frame appears to reference a state of things, a condition that exists. Something like," she searched for the right words. "The frame says, Given that this is true, given that some condition is true, what follows is the directive. And what condition? I still don't. Peta stopped. She stared at her notepad. Something she had written 4 hours ago and passed over was suddenly sitting differently in her mind. The spatial reference in the frame. I read it as a location marker. But spatial references in a mathematically structured language wouldn't just mean a location. They'd mean... She grabbed her pen and started writing fast. They'd mean a state of a location, a condition of a place. She was writing faster. The frame isn't saying you are here. It's saying this place is in a state that we might not have known about before they arrived. They're not giving us an ultimatum in the traditional sense. They're saying, given that this place is in this condition, yield within 20 seconds. Sarah looked at her. What condition? Peta looked up from her notepad. Her face had an expression that Sarah had no name for. Not fear exactly, and not wonder exactly, but the particular state of a mind that has just touched the edge of something enormous. I think they're saying this place is dangerous, Peta said. I think they came here because this sector is dangerous, and the directive to leave, it wasn't an ultimatum. It was a warning. The bridge was absolutely silent. Sarah looked at the bone-shaped ship. She looked at the growing distortion around its hull. She thought of the static on all 31 days of communication frequencies. She thought of the relay stations that Lena hadn't wanted to say were gone. She thought of how they had arrived in Sector 9 14 months ago and how, in all that time, they had never seen another ship. Not a single ship. Not from Earth. Not from anywhere. What is wrong with this sector? She said quietly. Nobody had an answer. But something did. At 0341 hours, every sensor on the Ardent fired simultaneously, not with the alert tones of detected objects but with a low, vibrating harmonic that none of them had ever heard before, a sound the ship made when its sensors were registering something they had no category for. The main screen filled with data, not the clean readable data of normal sensor returns, but cascading numbers that kept changing as fast as they appeared, as if whatever the sensors were trying to measure refused to hold still long enough to be measured. What is that?
Sarah said.
Yusuf stared at his screen. His face had gone pale. It's coming from below us, he said. From the space below the ship. He stopped. Commander, something is opening. It didn't open like a door. It opened the way a bruise opens, slowly, spreading from a central point outward, the space itself darkening and then brightening in a sequence that had no physics behind it that the Ardent systems could locate. The sensors kept firing their harmonic tone, that low vibration that hummed through the deck plating and into the boots of every person standing at their station, and Sarah felt it in her teeth, in her jaw, in the back of her skull. Distance, she said. 400 kilometers below current position, Yusuf said. His voice was very steady. Sarah made a mental note, later, to commend him for that steadiness. The opening, I'm calling it an opening because I don't have another word. It's currently measuring approximately 2 kilometers across, and it's still expanding. Rate of expansion? Irregular. It pulses. Each pulse expands the diameter by approximately 40 meters. How many pulses since it started? Yusuf counted. 7. Sarah did the math. 7 pulses, 40 meters each, starting from something. She looked at the cascading sensor data on the main screen, at the numbers that wouldn't hold still, at the shape the phenomenon was drawing in the space below them. She looked at the bone-shaped ship 700 kilometers off the port bow.
Peta, she said.
Have they sent anything new? No new transmissions since the directive. Are they watching us? Their signal architecture. Peta thought for a moment. Their signal architecture is built on relational mathematics. They understand positions. They understand the relationship between one position and another.
Yes.
I think they are absolutely watching us. What does it mean that they're not transmitting anything new? Peta was quiet for a moment. It might mean they're waiting to see what we do. Another pause. Or it might mean they don't think there's anything left to say. The second option sat in the air of the bridge like something physical. The thing below them pulsed again. 40 meters wider. Dex pulled up a navigational display on his panel and turned it so Sarah could see. The Ardent's position. The opening below. the bone-shaped ship to port. He had drawn a simple diagram with the navigational stylus, a triangle with the Ardent at its apex. The 3 points of the triangle formed a geometry that Sarah stared at for several seconds. "We're in the middle," she said. "Yes," Dex said. "Whatever that thing below us is, we are directly above its center of expansion. If it keeps growing at a consistent pulse rate," he hesitated. He was a careful man who did not say things without running the numbers first. He had run the numbers. "In approximately 22 minutes, it reaches the depth of our current position." And then, Dex didn't answer. "Dex. I don't know what happens then," he said. "I genuinely don't know. But the distortion around the alien ship's hull, I pulled the sensor history on it. It started the moment they arrived in this sector, and it's been growing at a rate that correlates almost exactly with the growth rate of the opening below us." He met Sarah's eyes. "I think the distortion is a defense. I think they came here, and they encountered that thing below us, and they built something around their ship to protect them from it. And they don't have that defense deployed to a radius that would include us," Sarah said slowly.
No.
700 kilometers is too far." He paused. "But here's the thing. The growth rate of the distortion around their ship. It's accelerating. Not just growing, accelerating. If you extrapolate that acceleration curve, it reaches the Ardent's position in," he checked his numbers again, "approximately 19 minutes. Sarah looked at him. "They can cover us," she said, "if we move toward them. And if," he stopped. "If what?" "If they let us." The thing below them pulsed. The harmonic tone moved through the ship's bones. Sarah stood up from the command chair and walked to the center of the bridge and stood there, in the exact center of it, and she looked at everything at once. The sensor readings, the navigational display, the image of the bone-shaped ship, the cascading numbers on the main screen. She stood there for 30 seconds, and she did not say anything, and nobody interrupted her. She was thinking about the 20-second directive. They had given the Ardent 20 seconds to leave. Not 20 minutes. Not an hour. 20 seconds. The Ardent couldn't leave in 20 seconds. Not safely, not with the coupling ring fractured, not at any thrust level that would create meaningful distance in 20 seconds. They knew that, Sarah realized. The beings on that ship had scanned the Ardent thoroughly enough to detect spatial reference positions and mass readings. They could certainly read engine output signatures. They knew the Ardent's thrust capacity. They knew 20 seconds was not enough time to leave. So, why 20 seconds? Why a deadline that was impossible to meet? She thought about PETA's partial translation of the frame. Given that this place is in this condition, yield. Yield. Not leave. Yield. She turned around. "PETA," she said. "The word you translated as yield, in their compression gradient language, is it specifically positional? Does it specifically mean move the ship away?" PETA looked at her notes. She was quiet for almost a minute, working through the mathematics of it, and the bridge waited. "The pressure gradient that I read as yield. It's directional, yes. It implies a change of position." But she was writing. The mathematical relationship inside the word. It's not specifically distance. It's... She looked up. Her eyes were sharp behind her glasses. "It's angle. The directive is about angle, not distance. They're asking us to change our angle relative to something." "Relative to the opening below us," Sarah said. PETA stared at her. "We're directly above the center of that opening," Sarah said. "If we move, not away, not out of the sector, just sideways, we're no longer directly above it." PETA worked through the mathematics in 11 seconds. "Yes," she said quietly. "That would satisfy the geometric relationship in the directive." "How far sideways?" "The angular mathematics would be satisfied at numbers, fast. 40 kilometers minimum lateral displacement. The angle changes enough at 40 kilometers. "Dex," Sarah said. "Lateral burn, 40 kilometers, north relative to current orientation. What's our time at 55% thrust?" Dex was already calculating. 2 minutes 40 seconds. "Do it." "Commander," Lena said from the weapon station. Her voice was very controlled. "Moving toward the alien ship. Moving laterally. Not toward. We're changing our angle relative to the opening, not our distance relative to them. They might not see it that way." They might not, Sarah agreed. But I think they will. Because I think they understand angle better than distance. I think that's what their language is built on. She looked at the bone-shaped ship.
Dex.
Lateral burn.
Now.
The Ardent moved. Not gracefully. She never moved gracefully. The 3 drive chambers in her belly groaned into life at 55%, and the ship swung sideways through the black of Sector 9, and for 2 minutes and 40 seconds, everyone on the bridge held themselves very still and watched the sensor readings and waited. The opening below them pulsed twice more. At 42 kilometers lateral displacement, Dex cut the engines. The harmonic tone from the sensors dropped. Not to zero, whatever was below them was still there, still growing, but the peak intensity dropped, and the cascading numbers on the main screen began to slow, began to hold still for fractions of a second longer between changes. We're no longer above the center, Yusuf said. And the alien ship? Sarah asked. Lena checked. She checked twice. The distortion around their hull, it just changed shape. It's not a perfect sphere anymore. She rotated the sensor image on her screen. It's extending, like an arm. It's extending in our direction. The bridge went very still. A slow curve of protected space, reaching across 700 kilometers of Sector 9, reaching toward the Ardent like the deliberate, careful extension of a hand. Marcus Vey, who had come back to the bridge an hour ago and stationed himself at the wall beside the auxiliary chair without anyone asking him to leave, said quietly, "They're trying to cover us." "Yes," Sarah said. "They've been trying to cover us the whole time," he said. "That was the directive. Move so we can reach you." The distortion field extended. It reached the Ardent in 4 minutes and 12 seconds, and when it touched the ship's hull, the harmonic tone dropped to almost nothing, and the cascading sensor numbers finally held still. Sarah sat back down in the command chair. She realized her hands were shaking slightly. She put them in her lap and waited for them to stop. When the distortion field settled around the Ardent, something changed in the ship's instruments. Not a failure. Not a warning. A clarification. For 31 days, the communication frequencies had been pure static. In the 4 minutes after the distortion field reached the ship, the static thinned, not completely, but enough that underlying structure became visible in it, the way fog thins at dawn, and you can start to see the shapes of buildings you already knew were there. Lena stared at the communications panel for a long time before she said anything. "There are signals in the static," she said. Sarah looked up. "Fleet command." "No." Lena's voice was careful. "Not human signals, but structured ones. Multiple sources." And a pause. "Some of them are very old. The signal decay patterns suggest some of these transmissions have been traveling through this sector for," she looked at the numbers, "for a very long time. Centuries, maybe more." "From where?" "Different directions. Different origins." Lena looked at Sarah. "Commander, I think this sector has been a communication crossroads for a long time. Something has been routing through Sector 9 for a very long time. The static wasn't interference. The static was signal. More signal than our instruments could parse, so it read as noise." Sarah absorbed this. "And the opening below us?" "I think." Lena moved to look at Yusuf's sensor panel alongside him. "I think it's the source, or the entrance to the source. Whatever is below us, it's been generating this field of signals for centuries. Things flying through the sector, stopping here, trying to reach it, maybe trying to communicate with it, maybe trying to study it. And not always succeeding," Sarah said. "Not always succeeding," Lena agreed quietly. The relay stations, Sarah thought. 31 days of silence. She had already started to believe the stations were gone. How many other things had passed through Sector 9 and not come out. She stood up and walked to the main screen, which was now showing a composite image, the distortion field surrounding both the Ardent and the bone-shaped ship in an extended envelope, the opening below them still pulsing and expanding but no longer directly beneath their hull. In the composite image, the two ships looked almost close to each other, connected by the invisible geometry of the field. She asked the question she had been building toward for several minutes.
"Peeta, can we talk to them?"
Not just respond to their signal architecture. Actually initiate communication. Ask them something. PETA had been working toward the same question. She had a signal prepared, built carefully over the last hour in the compression gradient language, using the mathematical relational structures she now understood well enough to compose in as well as read. "I can try," she said. "What do you want to ask?" Sarah thought about it. Not "who are you?" They might not have a concept of identity that translated. Not "what is that thing below us?" Too broad. She thought about the frame structure PETA had identified. Given that this is true, the following directive applies. A language built around conditions and responses. A mind that thought in terms of given this, therefore that. "Ask them," Sarah said slowly, "what the condition is. The frame condition. The thing that makes the directive necessary. What is the state of this place that requires yielding?" PETA built the signal. It took 20 minutes and 3 revisions, and when she sent it, the bridge was quiet for the duration of the transmission. Everyone listening, even though they couldn't hear it, the signal going out in pure mathematics. The bone-shaped ship received it, responded in 41 seconds, which, PETA noted with a flicker of something in her expression, was very fast. They had been waiting. The response was long, the longest single transmission they had sent. The matrix processed it in waves, and PETA sat with her notepad and wrote and rewrote and wrote again, and Sarah waited, standing at the main screen, watching the composite image of the 2 ships sitting together in the glow of the extended distortion field. After 37 minutes, PETA looked up. "I have a partial translation," she said. "Maybe 60%. The concepts don't map cleanly to English. I'm going to give you the mathematical shape of the meaning rather than a direct translation, because a direct translation would be misleading." "Go ahead." PETA looked at her notepad. "The thing below us, they have a term for it that I'm going to render as the unfinished place. Their language describes it as a location that is simultaneously itself and not yet what it is becoming. A place that is in the process of becoming something else, something very different from what it currently is, but that process is not complete. The mathematics of the term implies that this process has been going on for an extremely long time and will continue for an extremely long time." "Is it dangerous?" PETA looked at her notes. "That's the most interesting part. Their language doesn't distinguish between dangerous and not dangerous in the way we would. The closest concept in their signal architecture to our word danger is," she searched for it, "a mathematical relationship of incompatibility. 2 systems that are structurally incompatible. Not hostile, not malicious. Just," she paused, "like how water and fire aren't enemies. They're just incompatible. Water doesn't hate fire. But if you stand in the middle of both, you have a problem." Sarah stared at her. "We're incompatible with the unfinished place," she said.
"Yes."
"And I think," PETA hesitated. She looked at her notes again. "I think the distortion field they extended to us, it isn't a shield from attack. It's closer to an insulation. They've insulated us from the incompatibility, the way you'd insulate a wire. They wrapped us in something that makes us compatible," Sarah said. "Temporarily compatible," PETA said. "The mathematics of the term they use for the field includes a duration marker. It's not permanent." "How long?"
PETA checked.
"I don't have a precise conversion. But the duration marker is significantly longer than the 20-second directive." She allowed herself a very small, exhausted smile. "We have time." Sarah turned back to the main screen. She looked at the bone-shaped ship, at its strange asymmetrical hull with its unexplained protrusions, at the distortion field that it had extended across 700 kilometers of alien space to reach them. "They didn't warn us away, because they wanted us gone. They warned us away because they were trying to reach us." She thought about 20 seconds. An impossible deadline. A deadline designed not to be met in the way they'd initially understood it, not to demand departure, but to demand movement. Any movement. Change your angle. Stop being directly above the unfinished place so we can extend our field to cover you. 20 seconds, because they had seen the thing below beginning to pulse, and every pulse was 40 meters, and they had calculated exactly how much time the Ardent had before its position became critically incompatible. They had come to Sector 9 to study the unfinished place. And they had found, unexpectedly, a small pig-shaped human ship directly above it, completely unprotected, with no idea what they were sitting on. "They saved us," Marcus said quietly from the wall. That's what happened. They showed up, calculated the danger, tried to warn us in the fastest way they could, and when we didn't move in time, he paused. They came to us instead. Sarah looked at him. Yes, she said. We almost didn't move at all, he said. We came very close to just sitting there. We moved, she said. Barely. Barely counts, she said, and her voice was quiet and not entirely steady. In my experience, barely counts exactly the same as comfortably. She turned to Peta. Tell them thank you, she said. I don't know how to say thank you in their language. Find the closest mathematical relationship to gratitude, to the acknowledgement of a gift that was not owed. Peta thought for a moment. She began to build the signal. I think I know how to say it, she said. In their language, I think gratitude would be expressed as, she wrote it out, the recognition of an asymmetrical relationship that has been made symmetric. The thing that was one-sided, their knowledge, their protection, being acknowledged so that now both sides know the same thing. That's beautiful, Sarah said. It's mathematics, Peta said. I know, Sarah said. That's why it's beautiful. The signal went out. Peta had spent 40 minutes constructing what she was increasingly confident was an authentic expression of gratitude in the alien compression gradient language, not a mimicry, not a mathematical coincidence, but a genuine structural statement built from the relational logic she had absorbed over the past hours. She sent it and then sat back in her chair and realized for the first time that her body hurt. All of it. The accumulated hours of tension had settled into her joints and her shoulders and the backs of her eyes, and she sat very still for a moment and let herself feel it. Sarah noticed. Sleep, she said. When they respond. You can read the response when you wake up. With respect, Commander. Peta. A pause. 3 hours, Peta said. 4. Peta almost argued. Then she went to the bunk room that Dex had designated as the rotation rest space for bridge officers, and she was asleep within 4 minutes of lying down, still wearing her uniform, her notepad clutched against her chest like something important she wasn't ready to put down. The bone-shaped ship responded to the gratitude signal in 6 hours. Sarah was awake for all 6 of them. She read status reports. She walked the ship twice, end to end, speaking briefly to the crew in the corridors and the engineering bays. Not formal check-ins, just the quiet presence of someone moving through the spaces where people worked and worried. In the engine compartment, Chief Engineer Rose Tamayo had the secondary coupling ring stripped down to its components on the maintenance table, working on the stress fracture with a methodical attention that Sarah found deeply reassuring. Rose didn't look up when Sarah came in. How bad?
Sarah said.
Survivable, Rose said, which was her word for not ideal but workable. I can't restore full integrity without parts one don't have, but I can reinforce the existing structure with composite wrap from the repair stores. It'll hold through standard operations. It won't hold through emergency maximum thrust. We won't need emergency maximum thrust, Sarah said. Rose looked up for the first time. Her eyes were evaluating. You sound like someone who believes that. I'm someone who is choosing to believe that, Sarah said, which was different, and both of them knew it. Rose nodded once. I'll have it wrapped in 2 hours. Sarah continued through the ship. She stopped at the mess hall, where a cluster of junior crew were eating and talking in the careful way of people who are managing fear through the performance of normalcy. She sat with them for 15 minutes. She didn't offer reassurances she didn't have. She listened to a long story from Ensign Park about a kayaking trip he had taken in Norway the year before leaving for deep space, and she found herself genuinely interested in it. The color of the fjord water, the weight of the paddle, the way the mountains came down sheer to the waterline, and she thought that the capacity to be genuinely interested in someone else's story was one of the most useful things a person could have. And she made a mental note to tell her crew that sometime. When she came back to the bridge, Lena met her with an expression that said something has happened. The alien ship responded, Lena said. And something else. While you were doing rounds, the static in the communication frequencies changed again. Sarah went to the communications panel. The static was different. Still not clean, still layered and complex, but where before it had been uniformly dense, now it had visible structure. Not the alien compression gradient language. Something else. Something that the translation matrix was attempting to decode with more success than it had managed before. What is this?
Sarah said.
It started about 90 minutes ago, Lena said. After we moved. After the distortion field covered us.
She paused.
I think the field is filtering the static. Not removing the signal, clarifying it. Like putting on glasses. Another pause. Commander, one of these signals is in a protocol I recognize. Recognize how? Lena's expression was very controlled. It's a modified version of the Deep Space Relay Compression Standard. The modification is significant enough that the matrix almost missed it. It's been compressed and recompressed multiple times, like a message that has been relayed through multiple intermediate stations, each one using a slightly different protocol. She met Sarah's eyes. It originated from humanity. I don't know when. I don't know from where. But somewhere in the static, there is a human signal. Sarah's hands went still on the panel. Can you extract it? Working on it. It's going to take time. It's buried under the other signals and the relay degradation is significant. Lena turned back to the panel. But it's there. Sarah straightened up. She looked at the main screen, the composite image of the two ships in the extended distortion field, the opening below still pulsing but distant now, the strange geometry of Sector 9 laid out in sensor data around them. And the alien response?
She said.
To the gratitude signal? PETA should be the one to translate it. I know. But you ran it through the matrix while you were waiting? Lena allowed a very small smile. I did. The matrix is getting better at the compression gradient language with every exchange. It's been building its own internal dictionary from the pattern relationships. This response is complex. But one element is very clear. She pulled up the matrix output on the secondary screen. This structure here. She highlighted a recurring pattern. The matrix cross-references it as a directional indicator combined with a sequential marker. It's pointing somewhere and indicating a sequence, a series of steps. They're telling us where to go, Sarah said. Or where not to go, Lena said. The matrix is still working out the valence. Positive direction or negative direction. Go here or don't go here. Both are possible. Sarah looked at the directional indicator on the screen. She looked at the navigational data running alongside it. The direction it was pointing, away from the opening below, away from the pulsing incompatibility of the unfinished place, through Sector 9 in a precise vector, led to a region of space that their charts labeled simply as unsurveyed. Which meant, she thought, that humanity had looked at it and seen nothing worth looking at. Humanity had been wrong before. Wake PETA, she said. She'll be angry that it's only been. She checked the time. 3 hours and 12 minutes. Tell her I'm sorry, and tell her the response came in. Lena nodded and reached for the intercom. Sarah sat back down in the command chair and looked at the direction the alien signal was pointing, into the unsurveyed dark, into the region of Sector 9 that no human eye had bothered to examine carefully. She thought about the relay stations that were gone. She thought about a human signal buried in centuries of layered transmission. She thought about two ships sitting together in a borrowed field of insulation, in a sector of space that was in the process of becoming something neither of them fully understood. Barely counts exactly the same as comfortably. She had said that to Marcus 20 minutes ago, and she had believed it at the time. She still believed it. But she was also aware, with the patient clarity of someone who had learned to pay attention, that barely was not the same as safely. Barely was the beginning. Barely was where you started working with what you had. She had a crew of 219. She had a ship that had been called the Pig with affection. She had a linguist who understood gratitude as an asymmetric relationship made symmetric. She had a direction. She began to plan. PETA arrived on the bridge with her notepad already open and a look in her eyes that was not anger. She had been awake enough on the walk from the bunk room to process the interruption from sleep into something more like anticipation. She went directly to the communications panel, accepted the translation matrix output from Lena without ceremony, and sat down to read. She worked for 48 minutes. Sarah gave her space. She occupied herself with the engineering update from Rose. The coupling ring was reinforced. The The ship was cleared for extended standard operations, and with the crew rotation schedule, and with a slow, careful second pass through everything the sensors had recorded since the distortion field had settled around them. There was detail in the sensor data she had missed initially, things that had seemed like background noise, and now resolved into pattern under the clarifying effect of the field. The opening below them was not random. It had a pulse frequency. Not constant, it varied, but it varied according to a pattern that repeated every 43 minutes. Pulse, pause, and the pauses were not equal. They were shorter in some places and longer in others, and the sequence of pulse intervals, when Yusuf laid them out on a chart, described a shape. A shape that Yusuf, with the careful objectivity of a sensor officer who had learned in the last several hours not to assume anything, described as resembling a closed curve. Like a circuit? Sarah said. Or like a message, Yusuf said. If you convert the pulse intervals to a binary alternation, long pause as one value, short pause as another, you get a repeating binary string. He showed her. Ones and zeros, cycling. I'm not saying it's a signal. I'm saying it has the structural properties of one. Sarah looked at the binary string. What does the translation matrix say? Nothing yet. Binary isn't the same as language. But, Yusuf hesitated. If you apply the relational mathematical framework from the alien compression gradient language to this binary string, treating the intervals as relationships rather than discrete symbols, he had already done this. He pulled up the result. It looks like a state description, the same type of structure as the frame in the alien transmissions, given that this is the condition. The unfinished place, Sarah thought, was describing its own condition. How long had it been doing that? Centuries, if the layered signals in the static were any indication. Centuries of transmitting its own condition into the surrounding space, and every vessel that passed through Sector 9 had read that transmission as static. She thought about the relay stations. She thought about what it might mean to park a deep space relay station directly in the path of a centuries-old incompatibility field without knowing it was there. She thought about the human signal buried in the static. Not from the relay stations, Lena had said. The relay stations were a recent development. This signal was older. Much older. Sarah was still sitting with this when Peta looked up from the translation matrix output. I have the response, Peta said. The bridge oriented toward her. Not dramatically. People didn't turn dramatically in real life when they were exhausted and afraid. They just went still in slightly different configurations, which was the real human version of paying attention. The directional element is positive, Peta said. Not don't go there, go there. The direction they're indicating is an invitation. She paused to check a detail. The sequential marker alongside it. I was reading it as a series of steps, and that's partially right. But the mathematical structure of the sequence has a property I want to describe carefully. She looked at her notepad. In their language, sequential structures can be either closed or open. A closed sequence has a defined endpoint, step 1, step 2, step 3, arrive. An open sequence has no defined end. It continues past any individual position, and each position in the sequence enables the next, which enables the next, which enables the next. The invitation is to an open sequence, Sarah said. Yes. Peta looked up from her notepad. Her eyes were tired but clear. They're not giving us coordinates. They're giving us an entry point into an ongoing process. They're saying, come to this place, and what follows from coming to this place will follow from that. They're not telling us what we'll find. They're telling us that finding it is a step in something that continues. Something that continues for them too? Peta thought about it carefully. The way they structure the invitation, the relational mathematics of it, she checked her notes. They place themselves inside the sequence. Not as guides. As co-participants. The bridge was quiet for a moment with the weight of this. Dex broke it, practically, as was his way. Navigation. Where does the vector lead? Specifically. Sarah nodded at him. He had the navigational systems running. The vector the alien signal indicated projected forward through space at the standard heading it suggested. It led to a point approximately 93 hours travel from their current position, at 55% thrust. The destination was in the unsurveyed region. No human sensor had ever been pointed at it directly. Their charts showed nothing, not empty space, not the conventional markings for nothing to see, but the blank of spaces never examined. 93 hours, Sarah said. At our current thrust level, Dex confirmed. Sarah looked at the main screen. At the bone-shaped ship, still sitting off the port bow, its distortion field still extended around both of them. At the opening below, still pulsing in its 43-minute repeating cycle. At the vector that led into the unsurveyed region.
"PETA," she said.
Can you tell them we accept the invitation? That will follow them? Yes, PETA said. I know how to say alongside. Send it. The signal went out. The bone-shaped ship received it and responded almost instantly. A brief, single transmission that the Matrix interpreted with high confidence as acknowledgement. And then, slowly, with a grace that the Ardent could never match and that made several people on the bridge simply stop and watch, the alien ship began to move. Not fast. Not dramatically. It moved the way water moves over smooth stone, with an inevitability that didn't need to announce itself. It moved in the direction of the vector, into the unsurveyed region, and the distortion field moved with it, and the field remained extended, and the Ardent was still inside it. They were being escorted. Match their heading, Sarah said quietly. Matching, Dex said. The Ardent turned, groaning through the turn, as she always groaned, inelegant and reliable, the pig in her element, and followed. Sector 9 fell behind them, the opening below now off their stern, still pulsing in its 43-minute rhythm, still broadcasting its condition into the surrounding centuries. Sarah watched it on the aft sensor feed until it was too far to distinguish from background signal. She turned back to the forward screen. The unsurveyed region. Nothing on the charts. No human record of having looked. She thought of her father, who had spent his life working at the edge of things, who had read the same paperback books over and over without finishing them because he said the middle of a story was the best part, the part where everything was still possible. She thought, this is the middle. Everything was still possible. On the second day of travel, Lena isolated the human signal from the static. It took 17 hours of focused work, with help from Ensign Park, who turned out to have a natural facility with signal architecture that surprised his supervisor and unsurprised nobody who had watched him work over the past several days. They stripped the signal layer by layer, tracing the relay degradation backward, converting each layer's compression protocol into the previous one, until what had been buried under centuries of layered transmission resolved into something clean and readable. It was not a distress signal. It was not a navigation beacon. It was a log. A voice log, initially. A woman's voice, speaking with the particular careful clarity of someone recording a message they expect will be heard without context, who is therefore providing as much context as they can. The timestamp was degraded beyond recovery. The origin coordinates were similarly lost. What remained was the voice and the words, and the quality of both. Her name, she said, was Dr. Anna Voss. She had been the chief science officer of the research vessel Parallax, which had entered Sector 9 on a mapping expedition that had subsequently. She paused here, and there was something in the pause that Sarah heard as the careful composure of a person who had recently been afraid, encountered an anomaly. She described the anomaly. Her description, 40 years or 400 years old, matched the opening below Sector 9 with a precision that made the bridge go absolutely quiet. She called it the threshold, not the unfinished place. That was the alien terminology. She called it the threshold, and her description of it was different from the alien description in one significant way. Where the alien compression gradient language described it as a location in the process of becoming something else, Anna Voss described it in terms of its effect on observation. Every instrument she pointed at the threshold, she said, behaved differently from every other instrument. Not malfunction, not random noise, but a coherent pattern of different behaviors. As if each instrument were measuring the same phenomenon from a different angle and seeing something genuinely different because of the angle, not because of measurement error. It's not unstable, she said on the recording. Her voice was thoughtful and tired in equal measure. It's not unstable. It's multiple. The threshold is not one thing in one state. It is one space that is in multiple states simultaneously. Every instrument I point at it measures a different state because they're each, by the nature of measurement, selecting one state to interact with. The threshold doesn't have a condition. It has conditions. All of them true at once. She described what had happened to the parallax when they had sat directly above it for too long. Not catastrophically. They had moved in time, guided by. She hesitated here, and the hesitation had the texture of something she was choosing carefully how to describe, by another vessel that had come to their assistance. Sarah sat very still. Peeta sat very still. They looked at each other. Another vessel, Sarah said. With a distortion field, Lena said. She describes it. She doesn't know what it is. She says it felt like a filtering, like something being placed between her ship and the threshold that changed the nature of the incompatibility. They've been doing this for a long time, Marcus said from the wall. A very long time, Sarah said. She was thinking about the layered signals in the static. Centuries of transmission. How many ships have they saved? Nobody had an answer to that. The log continued. Anna Voss described being guided, as the Ardent was now being guided, along a specific vector. She described traveling for what she said was 4 days before reaching the destination. She described what she found there in language that was precise and controlled, and still somehow had the quality of someone describing a color they had only just seen for the first time. The recording ended there. Not at a natural stopping point. The file simply cut off, the signal degradation consuming the last section of data before it could be extracted. What Anna Voss had found at the end of the 4-day journey, they didn't know. Only that she had gone there, and that she had been going there in the company of the same ship, or a ship of the same kind, that now escorted the Ardent. She came back, Sarah said. Dex looked at her. You don't know that. She made a log, Sarah said. People making logs expect to come back. People who don't expect to come back write letters, not logs. She paused. And the signal was traveling outward from Sector 9, not inward. She sent it after. She passed back through and sent the log so that whatever she had found, Sarah stopped. She thought about it. So that whoever came next would know what they were going into. We came next, Marcus said quietly. We came next, Sarah agreed. She looked at the forward screen. The bone-shaped ship was ahead of them, its distortion field still extended, steady and certain in the direction it was traveling. It had not hesitated since they had begun following. It had not changed course, not increased speed, not done anything that suggested urgency or impatience. It moved with the equanimity of something that knew exactly where it was going, and had been going there for a very long time. Sarah thought about a woman named Anna Voss who had sat where Sarah was now sitting, or in a chair like it, on a ship like this one, in this same extended darkness, and who had looked at the same stars and decided to keep going. She made a decision. I want the log reconstructed as completely as possible, she said. Every word that can be recovered. The signal architecture, the compression protocols, everything Lena and Park extracted, document it completely. When we come back through Sector 9, she said when deliberately choosing it. When we come back through, we add our own log to the signal field. We add it to what Anna Voss sent. She looked around the bridge. We're not the first. We won't be the last. Let's make sure whoever comes next has more than we did. On the 3rd day, the Ardent developed a problem. It was not the coupling ring. Rose had the coupling ring under constant monitoring, and it was holding reinforced composite wrap performing exactly as she had calculated it would. The problem was different, smaller in mechanical terms and larger in timing. The atmospheric recycling system in the forward section of the ship, which had been running at diminished efficiency for the past several weeks, degraded past the threshold where diminished efficiency became an actual concern. Specifically, the carbon dioxide scrubbing capacity of the forward recyclers dropped to 63% of rated function. For a day or two, manageable. For the remaining travel time, plus a return journey, a problem. Rose brought it to Sarah in the same tone she used for everything, matter of fact, numerical, offering the situation's shape rather than her own alarm about it. The forward section of the ship housed 47 crew members. The recyclers could maintain safe atmospheric composition for all 47 at 63% capacity as long as no more than, Rose had calculated it precisely, 29 of them were resting in their quarters at any given time. The rest needed to be in the middle and aft sections, where the full-capacity recyclers were carrying the remainder of the load. Sarah absorbed this and then did what she always did with operational problems, which was to think about what it required rather than what it rolled out. We rotate the forward section crew through rest periods in groups, she said. I've already drafted the rotation schedule, Rose said, handing over a tablet. It's workable. It's also, she paused. It concentrates certain crew combinations in shared spaces at certain hours, which may generate some friction. Friction. Lieutenant Commander Reyes and Ensign Hashimoto have been avoiding each other since the incident in the Geology Bay 3 weeks ago. Sarah looked at the rotation schedule. She found the hours in question. Put them in the same rest rotation. Rose raised an eyebrow. People who avoid each other do it most effectively when the ship is running normally, Sarah said. We are not running normally. When the ship is running abnormally and people are afraid, avoidance becomes expensive. They'll talk. She handed the tablet back. They needed an excuse to talk. Rose looked at the schedule again. Or they'll make the recycler problem worse by arguing. Also possible, Sarah admitted. How confident are you in this 63% capacity? Confident enough to trust the calculation. Not confident enough to push it. Then we don't push it. We implement the rotation, and we watch the numbers, and we adjust if we need to. Rose nodded and left. Sarah went to the bridge and sat in the command chair and thought about proximity. The recycler problem was, at its core, a proximity problem. The ship's capacity to manage its own atmosphere was contingent on where people were, how close they were to each other, what they were doing. The alien distortion field was a proximity management system too, in its way, structuring the relationship between the Ardent and the incompatibility of the threshold by changing the nature of the contact between them. There was something philosophically consistent about this, Sarah thought. The universe seemed to be operating in this particular corner of Sector 9 through the management of relationships rather than the management of objects. The threshold's danger wasn't a force, it was an incompatibility, a relational property. The protection wasn't a shield, it was an insulation, a change in the terms of contact. The human signal in the static wasn't a broadcast, it was a conversation that had been left running, waiting for someone to join it. Even the 20-second directive. Not an ultimatum. A geometric instruction. Change your angle. Change the relationship between your position and the threshold. Sarah was still sitting with this when Peeta came to the bridge, with something new on her notepad. I've been working on the matrix continuously, Peeta said. The corpus of transmissions we have is large enough now that I'm starting to understand not just the architecture, but the idiom. The characteristic expressions. The way they say things that aren't just structural. She sat down. I've been running a retrospective translation on all the earlier transmissions. The first ones they sent before the directive. Before we responded. The transmissions Lena almost missed, Sarah said. The ones almost below the detection threshold. Yes. Peeta opened her notepad. Commander, they weren't broadcasting quietly because they were timid. They were broadcasting quietly because... She paused to find the right words. In their language, the transmission volume is a relational marker. A statement about the nature of the communication. Very quiet transmissions are, she checked her notes, private. Meant for the recipient only. They were transmitting privately because they didn't want the threshold to receive the signal. Sarah stared at her. They were hiding the message from the opening below us. Yes, Peeta said. And when you look at the content of those early quiet transmissions through the matrix, she turned her notepad so Sarah could see the translated output. They were telling us about the threshold. In detail. Much more detail than the directive. Everything they knew about it, its pulse cycle, its incompatibility properties, the history of its observed behavior. A pause. They were trying to give us a full briefing.
Before the deadline.
But they had to transmit quietly enough that the threshold didn't detect the signal, which meant transmitting below our normal detection threshold. She stopped. She looked at Sarah with an expression that had several things in it at once. They were whispering to us, so that something dangerous wouldn't overhear. Sarah sat in silence for a long moment. They knew we couldn't read it, she said. They knew the signal was below our detection threshold. They sent a full briefing that they knew we couldn't receive. Yes.
Why? Peeta looked at her notepad.
The mathematics of the act itself, the act of sending a message that may not be received, has a structural meaning in their language. When you transmit a message whose receipt is uncertain, the act of transmitting is itself a statement. The statement is, she thought, something like, I will do what can be done even when the outcome is uncertain. It's both practical and, she searched, ceremonial. Both at once. They sent the briefing because it was the right thing to do regardless of whether we could hear it. And they sent the directive loudly enough for us to detect because that was the urgent thing. They were being thorough, Sarah said quietly. They were doing everything they could, in the order of urgency, and they didn't stop doing the less urgent things just because the urgent things took precedence. Yes, Peeta said. Sarah looked at the bone-shaped ship on the main screen. She thought about 219 people on a ship called the Pig, rotating through rest cycles to manage recycler capacity, watching sensor data, eating in the mess hall, telling stories about Norwegian fjords. She thought about a bone-shaped ship, traveling for what might be centuries through a sector of space that concealed something none of them fully understood, extending a field of insulation to every vessel they found sitting directly above it, transmitting detailed briefings in a frequency below detection because the right thing was still worth doing even when the outcome was uncertain. Tell them, Sarah said. Tell them we found their quiet transmissions. That we're reading them now. That, she paused. She thought about Peeta's definition of gratitude. The asymmetric made symmetric. Tell them that what they gave us in a frequency we couldn't hear, we can now hear. The information they offered without knowing if we'd receive it. We received it. Peeta smiled. A real smile. The first purely uncomplicated smile Sarah had seen from anyone on the bridge since this began. I know how to say that, she said. She built the signal. She sent it. 90 hours and 17 minutes after leaving their position above the threshold, the sensors began returning data about the destination. It started as a gravitational anomaly, a region of space where the metric was slightly different, where the standard background curvature that you could predict anywhere in known space was off by a margin too small to see with the naked eye and too consistent to be measurement error. Then the anomaly resolved. Not a single gravitational signature but a structured one, the kind produced by objects in organized relationship to each other, the kind that had a geometry. Then the geometry became visible. At 41 kilometers, the main screen showed them what was there, and the bridge was silent for a full 2 minutes. It was a station. Not a human station. Not a single alien station. A structure that had been built by multiple builders over what the compositional sensor readings suggested was an extremely long period of time. Its different sections composed of different materials, constructed in different architectural idioms, connected by transition spaces that were themselves distinct from either the sections they joined. It was enormous. It was irregular in the way of things that have grown rather than been designed, and it was lit internally in a spectrum that ran from wavelengths the Ardent's visible light cameras could capture to wavelengths they couldn't, so that the station appeared to have sections that simply weren't there until you shifted the sensor feed to a different detection band and found them. Many distinct architectural components. Sarah asked. Yusuf was counting. I'm at 14 and I haven't finished the exterior survey. The sensor return is, he adjusted his instruments. It's very detailed. There's a lot here. How old? The oldest compositional readings are, he checked his calibration 3 times. Old enough that I want to be careful about this number, Commander. But the matrix is consistent. The oldest sections of this structure have a compositional age reading that places their construction at approximately, he looked at her, 4,000 years. The bridge absorbed this. For 1,000 years, Dex said. Give or take the uncertainty margin on deep compositional analysis, which I'll put at plus or minus 300 years. Yusuf looked at the main screen. The station has been here for at least 3,700 years. Minimum. Sarah looked at the bone-shaped ship, still moving ahead of them, still steady, leading them in toward the station with the same unhurried certainty it had maintained for 90 hours. They come here often, Sarah said. This isn't a discovery for them. This is, she thought about the open sequence, the entry point into an ongoing process. This is where the sequence leads. They've been here before. And they brought us, Marcus said. And they brought us, Sarah agreed. She thought about Anna Voss, who had been brought here too, and had found something at the end of 4 days of travel that she had described with the language of a person discovering a color they had never seen before. And then she thought, for the first time, directly about what it meant that the station existed. 3,700 years. 14 distinct architectural components. Multiple builders. All of them, presumably, passing through Sector 9. All of them, presumably, protected by the distortion field. All of them, in turn, at different points across 40 centuries, guided to this place and, by being guided, becoming part of the ongoing thing. The station wasn't built by one species. It had been built by every species that the bone-shaped ships had guided through Sector 9 and brought here. It's a meeting place, Peeta said softly. She had reached the same conclusion from the architectural side rather than the historical side, and her voice had the quality of someone who has understood something that keeps getting larger the more you look at it. Every species that passed through the threshold sector, every ship that was above the threshold when these ships arrived, they were all brought here. And they all, she looked at the station, they all contributed. The threshold, Sarah said. Does it matter? The threshold specifically? Why Sector 9?
Peeta thought about this.
She looked at her notes on the threshold's pulse cycle, the multiple simultaneous states, the incompatibility. The threshold is in the process of becoming something else, she said slowly. Something that none of them can predict, because the mathematics of simultaneous states don't resolve into a single predictable outcome. It's uncertain. It's genuinely, fundamentally uncertain. She paused. Maybe that's why. Something that nobody can predict, that none of them can navigate alone, brings them together. The threshold doesn't threaten them. She searched for the right formulation. It humbles them. Equally. Every species that comes to Sector 9 faces the same thing none of them understand. And the response to being equally humbled, Marcus said from the wall, is to build a place where you can think about it together. Yes, Peeta said. Sarah sat in the command chair and looked at the station, 3,700 years old at minimum, built by 14 different hands, lit in wavelengths that human eyes had never evolved to see, and she thought about the Ardent. She thought about what the Ardent could contribute. Not firepower. Not superior technology. Not any of the things that military vessels were traditionally measured by. The Ardent had arrived in Sector 9 by accident. She had been on a resupply route to a rendezvous that might not exist anymore, with a fractured coupling ring and a failing recycler and 31 days of silence behind her. She had been directly above the threshold without knowing it, unprotected and unaware. And she had, when offered a direction, moved. She had moved when the direction was unclear. She had moved when the deadlines seemed impossible. She had moved, not far, not gracefully, not with certainty, but she had moved, and that had been enough for the distortion field to reach her. Barely counts exactly the same as comfortably. Maybe that was the contribution. Maybe arriving barely was its own kind of answer. She stood up from the chair. Hail the station, she said. Whatever frequency, whatever protocol. Peeta, build something in the compression gradient language. Lena, run our standard contact frequencies simultaneously. Yusuf, active scan on the station, everything we have, and document every reading. We are going to document this completely. We are going to add what we know to what is known here. She looked around the bridge. Every one of you, whatever your station has seen since we entered Sector 9, I want it in the log. Everything. The threshold's pulse cycle. The human signal. Anna Voss's log. The translation architecture Peeta built. Everything. We arrived here as, she paused. As the Ardent. As a ship that didn't expect to be here and almost wasn't. And we're going to contribute everything we have. Dex said quietly. And the warship aspect, Commander?
We do have weapons.
However minimal. Sarah looked at him. She looked at the station. Power them down, she said. Fully. Safe the entire weapons system. She looked at the main screen. Nothing that reads as threatening. Whatever the Ardent has, we are offering it, not pointing it. Dex nodded. He reached over to the weapons panel. Lena was already doing it, and the weapons system powered down to standby, then to safe, then to the full cold shutdown that meant they were not a warship right now.
They were just a ship.
The bone-shaped vessel led them the last few kilometers to the station. And the station, lit in colors they could almost but not quite see, opened its approach corridor to receive them. The docking sequence took 6 hours. Not because of difficulty, The station's approach systems were sophisticated enough to communicate with the Ardent's navigation computers directly, interfacing through what Dex described as a protocol layer he had never seen before but that behaved as if it had been designed to be compatible with anything. The 6 hours were measured time. The station was processing something, working through some procedure that had a pace of its own, and the Ardent waited inside the approach corridor with the patience of a ship whose crew had learned, in the past several days, something about the value of letting things move at their own speed. During the 6 hours, things happened. The communication frequencies inside the approach corridor clarified further than they had in open space. The filtering effect of the corridor's structure was more focused than the distortion field had been in open space, and signals that had been partially visible in the static became fully readable. There were 17 distinct active transmissions coming from inside the station, not archives, not historical recordings, but live ongoing communications happening right now, in 17 different signal architectures that ranged from compression gradient mathematics to something that used structured light pulses to something that the Ardent's translation matrix, frankly, described as unknown principle, possible biological transmission medium. 17 different species, or 17 different vessels, or 17 different signals from the same species, using different communication systems at different times. They didn't know. What they knew was that it was live. The station was occupied. Peta sat at her station and listened to all 17 simultaneously, running them through the matrix in parallel, building a map of the signal landscape inside the station that she was already thinking of as the beginning of something, a document, a record, the start of a translation corpus that would take years to complete.
She was not daunted by this.
She was the opposite of daunted. She looked like someone who has just been handed the rest of their life's work and discovered that it is exactly what they wanted. Lena isolated the human transmission first, because she was Lena and she worked systematically outward from the known. It was not Anavas. It was newer. The compression protocol was recognizable, a variant of the deep space relay standard that the Ardent herself used, modified in ways that suggested extended time and transmission through unusual media, but not yet degraded to the layer-buried artifact that Anavas's log had been.
It was a human voice.
A man's voice, with an accent that Lena placed as Northern European after a moment's attention. He was making a log. Day 42 inside the station structure, he said. We have completed the primary documentation of sections 1 through 7. The architectural analysis is a pause, and in the pause the voice changed register slightly, from professional to something warmer. Unprecedented. I don't have a better word. Dr. Kahananui has mapped the construction sequence across 11 sections, and we have confirmed at least 9 distinct builders. The section that appears to be oldest, the one we've been calling the root section, defies every dating method we have. Our best estimate is 4,000 years, but I want to be honest in this log, that estimate is almost certainly an undercount. The materials in the root section have properties we have not seen before. We're going to need a longer mission. He named his ship, the Wayfarer. He named his date of entry into Sector 9, 18 months ago.
He was still here.
Sarah listened to the log and thought, we're not the first humans here. She felt something about that, not disappointment, which would have been the wrong feeling, but something more like relief. They were not alone in this. Someone had already been in this place for 18 months, building documentation, mapping construction sequences, learning the root section. They had something to offer each other. The docking completed at hour 6 with a gentle pressurization sequence that the station managed through the corridor walls, equalizing the atmospheric conditions between the approach corridor and the Ardent's external hull with a delicacy that impressed Rose, who was monitoring it from engineering. The airlock opened. A man was standing outside it, not suited, not armed, wearing what looked like a worn field jacket and carrying a tablet and a thermos of something that steamed. He was tall, dark-haired, with eyes that had the particular quality of someone who has been in a remarkable place long enough to have processed the initial astonishment and arrived at a working relationship with it. He looked at Sarah. He looked at the Ardent's hull. He looked at the coupling ring reinforcement wrap that was visible on the exterior through the corridor's transparent section, at the dents and patches of a ship that had been through 14 months of deep space deployment. Sector 9, he said. Sector 9, Sarah confirmed. He nodded. You were above the threshold. Directly above it. For about 14 months. He absorbed this. You must have arrived after the last survey satellite. We sent a warning beacon through the sector when we mapped the threshold's incompatibility range. It was supposed to flag vessels before they entered the region. We didn't receive any warning beacon, Sarah said.
No.
His expression had a quality Sarah recognized, the look of someone recalibrating. No, you wouldn't have. The signal field around the threshold, he paused. The beacon would have read as static. A pause. I'm Dr. Emil Strand, Chief Archaeologist, Research Vessel Wayfarer. Commander Sarah Ellison, UESS Ardent. He extended his hand.
Come inside, he said.
There's a lot to show you. And I'd like to hear what you experienced at the threshold. We haven't had a vessel that was directly above the incompatibility zone since we've been here. The data would be. His eyes had the expression Peta had had when she realized the full scope of the translation work. Invaluable. Genuinely invaluable. Sarah looked back at her crew. At Dex. At Peta. At Lena. At Yusuf, who had kept his station for most of the last 4 days on rotation sleep cycles that added up to something adequate and not much more. At Marcus, who had followed her through the ship and sat in chairs that weren't his and made sure she ate. We have a linguist who's been building a compression gradient translation architecture from scratch, she said. And a complete sensor record of the threshold's pulse cycle. And a partial signal from a previous visitor, Dr. Anna Voss, Research Vessel Parallax, that we've recovered from the static. Emil Strand's expression changed significantly.
Anna Voss, he said.
You know her? She was the founding researcher for the project that eventually became the Wayfarer mission, he said. Her signal has been in the static we've never been able to recover it. The degradation was too severe by the time we got here. He looked at Sarah with an expression that had several things in it at once. You have her signal.
Part of it, Sarah said.
Enough. He was quiet for a moment. She survived, he said. We never knew definitively.
She made a log, Sarah said.
People making logs expect to come back. He was quiet again. Then he nodded, not just in acknowledgement, but in the way of someone receiving something that had been missing for a long time.
Come inside, he said again. And his voice was different this time. They came inside.
The station was called, in the closest approximation that Peta could render from the signal architectures of its 14 builders, something that translated roughly as the place where the uncertain is held together. Not resolved. Not explained. Held together, in the sense of a conversation that continues, of multiple incomplete understandings kept in contact with each other. The Ardent stayed for 11 days. In 11 days, things happened that Sarah would spend the rest of her life trying to accurately describe to people who had not been there and largely failing, not because the words were inadequate but because the experience had a quality of accumulation, layer on layer, day on day, that resisted compression into summary. On the first day, she walked the station with Emil Strand for 8 hours. He showed her the root section, the oldest portion, the part their dating methods called 4,000 years, and almost certainly undercounted. Its architecture used a geometry that human minds could follow, but that produced a consistent mild disorientation, as if the room was slightly larger on the inside than outside observation suggested. The material was smooth and dark and warm to the touch, warm the way something biological is warm rather than the way heated metal is warm, and Rose touched it once with her engineer's careful hands and then stood for a moment without speaking. It's not inert, Rose said. No, Emil confirmed. Our analysis suggests it's technically alive by 4 of the 6 definitions we use. We try not to touch it too much.
Rose removed her hand.
She looked at Sarah. Commander, she said carefully, this ship is going to be inadequate for what we need to study.
I know, Sarah said.
We need specialists. Multiple disciplines.
I know.
We need to report back, and we need to do it.
I know,
Sarah said for the 3rd time gently. We will. On the 2nd day, Peta met the linguist from the Wayfarer, a small, fierce woman named Dr. Yuki Tanaka, who had been working on the compression gradient language for the 14 months she had been at the station, and who looked at Peta's translation architecture with an expression of intense focus that rapidly shifted into something Sarah could only describe as recognition. The meeting of 2 people who have been working on the same problem from different directions and have just discovered that their solutions are compatible. They sat together for 11 hours on the second day, not emerging for meals, communicating with the rest of the crew through brief tablet messages that said things like, "We need the full corpus, please," and "Do not disturb us." On the third day, the bone-shaped ship transmitted a new signal. Not a directive, not a warning, a different structural type entirely. One that PETA, reviewing it with the now significantly expanded translation matrix, identified with high confidence as a question. Their first question to the Ardent. In all the exchanges, the directive, the gratitude, the invitation, the acknowledgement of the quiet transmissions, they had never asked a question. They asked one now. PETA sat with it for 4 hours. She brought the result to Sarah with the same stillness she had brought the threshold briefing and the 20-second directive, the stillness of a person who has touched the edge of something large. "They want to know," PETA said, "what we know about the threshold that they don't." Sarah looked at her. "They've been here for 40 centuries at minimum." "Yes." PETA sat down. "And they're still asking. They haven't figured it out either. They've been protecting vessels from its incompatibility and guiding them here and building the station, and they still don't know what the threshold is becoming." She looked at her notepad. "They came to us because," she stopped. She rethought the formulation. "Not because they thought we had the answer. Because the question is large enough that everyone's incomplete understanding contributes. Because they've been collecting incomplete understandings for 4,000 years, and none of them add up to a complete understanding yet, and they're still collecting." Sarah sat for a long time with this. She thought about Anna Voss, whose signal they had pulled from the static, who had described the threshold as having multiple simultaneous true states, and whose complete description they still didn't have because the log had been cut off. She thought about what Anna Voss might have figured out that nobody had recovered. She thought about the Ardent sensor record, the pulse cycle, the 43-minute rhythm, the binary string that Yusuf had found in the pulse intervals. The binary string that the translation matrix, when run against the alien relational framework, had read as a state description, a self-description, the threshold describing its own condition. "Yusuf," Sarah said. "The binary string from the threshold pulse. The state description." Yusuf had it ready. He had been carrying it with him the way you carry something you know is important but don't yet know why. He put it on the table between them, printed on actual paper because there was something about this that felt like it needed paper. Sarah looked at it. The threshold was in the process of becoming something else. Multiple simultaneous states. Every instrument measuring it from a different angle saw a different true thing. The incompatibility wasn't danger. It was the incompatibility of multiple truths existing in one place. The binary string was a repeating cycle. Not random, not noise. A state description that cycled back to its own beginning. "It's not describing what it is," Sarah said slowly. "It's describing what it's doing." PETA looked at her. "The cycle," Sarah said. "The pulse cycle isn't a process it's going through. It's a process it's making. It's not becoming something. She stopped. She held the thought carefully, the way you hold something fragile. It's practicing something. Repeating the same sequence of states in a cycle. Like when you're learning something. You run through the sequence again and again until it's stable. Until you can hold all the states at once without them collapsing into one." The bridge was very quiet. "The threshold is learning," PETA said. "The threshold is learning," Sarah said. She thought about that for a moment. Then she thought about something else. What happens when it finishes learning? Nobody had an answer to that. But nobody needed to have an answer to that. That, Sarah thought, was why the station existed. Not to figure out the answer, but to hold the question together, to keep the incomplete understandings in conversation with each other across 40 centuries of different species arriving by accident above a place that was learning something enormous, helped by ships that had been patient enough to offer a hand, guided toward a place where the humbling was shared. She thought about her father, reading the same books over and over, never finishing them, preferring the middle. She thought about Anna Voss, whose log had been buried in static for long enough to become part of the signal field, whose work had survived her in the way that careful work does. She thought about 219 people on a ship called the Pig who had arrived barely and stayed completely and were going home with things they hadn't known they would carry. On the fourth day, she dictated their log. She sat in the command chair with the recorder running and she told the whole story. Sector 9, 31 days of static, the bone-shaped ship appearing at close range, PETA building the translation architecture from zero, the 20-second directive, the geometric insight, the distortion field reaching them, Anna Voss's signal, the 93-hour journey, the station's 14 architectures, Dr. Emil Strand at the airlock with a thermos. She told it completely, and she told it carefully, and she told it in the voice of someone who expected to come back. On the 5th day, Rose told her the recycler was at 51% and needed physical replacement of components that they did not have and could not fabricate and would require dry dock. "How long can we stay?" Sarah asked. "Safely 3 more days," Rose said. "After that, I start making promises I won't be able to keep." 6 more days, Sarah said. Rose looked at her. "I'll get the atmospheric calculations from Dr. Strand's ship. Their recycler system is different from ours, but there may be compatible components." Sarah looked at Rose with the expression of someone asking not for permission, but for collaboration. 6 more days.
Rose thought about it.
Then she nodded. "I'll need 3 crew from engineering and full access to their technical archives." Done. On the 11th day, they left. The bone-shaped ship had been moving slowly around the station's perimeter for the full 11 days, following a pattern that PETA described as contemplative, a slow orbit that its signal architecture suggested was a form of continued engagement with the station, ongoing thought about the ongoing thing. As the Ardent began the departure sequence, the bone-shaped ship moved to accompany them to the sector boundary. It would escort them back through Sector 9. The distortion field remained extended. At the boundary of the unsurveyed region, where the charts went from blank to labeled, Sarah sat in the command chair and opened the all-crew channel. She had not prepared remarks. She had decided that prepared remarks were wrong for this. "We're going home," she said. "We're going home with a sensor record of a threshold phenomenon that has been humbling travelers for at least 4,000 years, with a partial translation architecture for a language we couldn't decode a week ago, with a recovered signal from a researcher named Anna Voss that we're going to deliver to her project's successors, with documentation of a station built by 14 different hands that is still actively occupied, and with the knowledge that every single thing we have, including the things we don't fully understand, is more than we had when we arrived." A pause. The Ardent was not supposed to be here. We were on a resupply route. We have a fractured coupling ring and a recycler that Dr. Strand's engineering team patched together in ways that Rose says are creative, and I choose to interpret as functional. We almost sat still above a threshold incompatibility until it became a serious problem. We moved instead. She paused again. "Barely counts the same as comfortably. I believe that more now than I did when I said it. What we have to offer is what we did, which is to move when moving was possible, even without certainty about what moving meant." She looked at the forward screen. Sector 9 ahead. The bone-shaped ship beside them, its distortion field steady and warm as insulation. "Set course for home," she said. 55%. We'll be there when we get there." Dex set the course. The Ardent, the pig, the swollen, wide-bodied, inelegant ship with her groaning drives and her composite-wrapped coupling ring and her creative recycler solution and her 219 people, moved forward into Sector 9, accompanied by something 40 centuries old that had come to them quietly in a frequency below detection and said, "We will do what can be done even when the outcome is uncertain." Sarah watched the stars. They still didn't twinkle out here, but she had stopped needing them to. End.